Hey everyone, Yolanda here, and welcome to the conversation. We are having a fantastic show tonight, and we have so much that we are going to have to unpack. We have two very, very dynamic guests that I am so excited to talk to tonight. And if you don't know them, then you absolutely will know them because they bring to the conversation a wealth of experiences, a wealth of knowledge in terms of their own leadership within the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. And they are here tonight to talk to you specifically about their thoughts on police reform. And of course, things that we can do in the wake of everything that is going on as we're taking a close and harder look at police and, of course, the police brutality that has been an issue for many years. But before we get into that, what I want to do is to, we need to take a more serious moment here. Um, it's very important that we not forget. I always talk about saying their names and obviously making sure that we don't forget people who have been taken from us due to gun violence. But more specifically, many of our lives were rocked 5 years ago when 9 lives were taken in Charleston at the Mother Emanuel Church massacre. Obviously, we don't say the name of the shooter. He doesn't matter. What matters are those 9 lives who were taken from us then, one being the sister of City Councilman Malcolm Graham. I send you healing vibes because I know this was a difficult day for you. So that being said, what is so important is that we not only forget to that we it's so important that we not forget, rather, to remember those whose lives were taken on that day, but also that we make sure that we remember that that process, that hurt, is also a place for healing for many of us. So to the family members, all of the family members and friends of the 9 lives that were taken at Mother Emanuel, we're thinking of you always, and we will never forget their names. So tonight's episode of the indictment, this segment is specifically called The Thin Blue Line, and we're talking about police reform. And so, what I want to do first of all is to shout out our first segment, which happened last week, where we talked about the criminal justice system in general and implicit bias in particular. So, I definitely want to give a shout out to attorneys Rob Corbett and Renee Little, who were absolutely phenomenal. If you missed that episode, you definitely want to go back to the conversation Facebook page or the YouTube channel because you can catch all of those previous episodes on our channel there. And we talked about the system as it relates to the high profile cases that we are all dealing with and we're seeing in the news on a regular basis. And this was, of course, before the killing of Rashard Brooks that just happened a few days ago. What we talked about specifically in that show was the pieces of the system that are important. We talked about, really prosecutorial discretion in terms of how people were charged or not charged, talking about theories of the case, but we also talked about implicit bias. And I encourage you to still, if you haven't already done so, go to implicit.harvard.edu and make sure that you take the implicit bias test, because we talked about a lot about that and how that intersects with justice, with how it intersects with how policing is done, how it intersects with how DAs make decisions in terms of whether to charge or not charge. It intersects with all of that. And I think the most powerful part of that episode is the end, where both Attorney Corbett and Attorney Little talked about their own personal experiences and those cases that either made you almost want to stop the practice of law or it lit a fire under you. So I encourage you to go back and check out that segment because it really was a great show, and I want to shout them out specifically. Now, before we dive into tonight's series of the indictment, make sure that you like and you follow and subscribe at all things at the Convo Pod Show. So if you've not done so already, please take a moment and go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. Make sure you go to the Instagram page and you follow. And if you haven't already liked the Facebook page, make sure that you do that as well. And of course, if you're tuning in later, then you can also catch the replay on the YouTube channel as well as the Facebook page. So tonight, this episode of the indictment talks about the thin blue line, what that is, and we're also going to take a deep dive into police reform. I think this topic is especially important in wake of what we've just learned today in terms of the two officers who were charged in the Ray Sharp Brooks killing, which happened just a few days ago in Atlanta in the Wendy's parking lot. I got a lot to say about that, but I'm gonna have the guests chime in as far as that's concerned. But one of the things that stuck out about that particular case from my perspective as a defense attorney and my perspective as a judge is the inadequacy of the investigation, and of course whether or not the use of force was even justified. So when we talk about what the system means or what the thin blue line is, it's important that we actually talk to the people who are involved in law enforcement in a way that we can actually get a close look at what it actually feels like. So our first guest, so excited to have her on. She is a veteran on the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. That's where she began her career. She ended her career just before retirement in 2020 as the assistant chief. She has rose through the ranks. She's been a trailblazer in many ways. She has most recently talked about police reform in her own platform in terms of some of the things that we can do. And she is a woman who is absolutely dedicated to that process in a real way. So, everyone, I need you to stop what you're doing and welcome Vicki Foster to the show. Hey, girl. Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Oh, I'm fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you
much
for
for
having me.
joining us tonight. Such a pleasure to have you. We're going to just jump right into it, but we want to talk a little bit about you first. Now, in a normal podcast situation, we would be in the studio and we'd be having your pictures and we'd be telling your story in a very deep and thought provoking way. But we'll come back to that. We'll do a full show later. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about your experiences, particularly from a female's perspective, because oftentimes I think that perspective is lost when we talk about law enforcement, even in the general perception of what a police officer looks like,
Mhm.
as well as how that thin blue line, if you will, how it even applies, if it applies to female officers. So, as I said in the intro, now you started off at CMPD in 1991.
Yes, I try to tell people I was like 12 years old, but yes, I did in 1991.
Yes, ma'am. And so why did you decide to go into law enforcement?
So, it's funny because people always ask me that question, and I wish I could just say, oh, it was because, I've always wanted to be a police officer, but that was really not the case.
Mm-hmm.
I actually needed a job, and I was part of what I did was in criminal justice. So, my minor was in criminal justice, and my master's in psychology. And so, I needed a job. And so I applied for a couple of agencies on a dare, actually. And
Are you serious?
I am. They actually did a news story about this a couple of years ago. And so me
Okay.
and the girl at UNCC, and she dared me. We went into the academy together, and I rode with her that day, and she quit the first day, so I had no ride home. But so she probably getting the last laugh. But so yeah, no, I never really wanted to be a police officer. I knew that I wanted to help people, but
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't know what that meant and what that looked like. So
Okay.
yes, that's kind of how I started. Believe it or not, as a dare.
Now, are you from Charlotte?
I am not. I am from Yanceyville, North Carolina, which is about 2 hours from here.
And where'd you go to
And,
undergrad?
yeah, UNC Charlotte. So
Okay.
went to UNC Charlotte for undergrad. Yeah,
Shout out to all the 49ers. Just
49ers.
saying. Okay, so when you came out, now your sec was you were a dual degree or did you have a minor? Was that a
So
dual
minor
degree?
was psychology. My minor was, I'm sorry, was criminal justice, and my major was psychology.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you began, obviously as what we would call it, I don't know if they called it hits back then or as far as a beat officer, if you will, on the street. Where were
Patrol.
you assigned?
So I was first assigned uptown to, a lot of people may remember, it was called Earl Village.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I was assigned. And I was actually a community police officer there for probably 6 or 7 years. So that's why I was first assigned uptown.
Okay. And so a community police officer then, what does that look like then versus how it's perceived now?
Whoa. Well, I think now it's more of a philosophy.
Hmm.
I think people just kind of talk about it in terms of community policing. When
Right.
we first started, obviously we didn't know what we were doing, but we truly were engaging with the community. And so we would go out and try to, make sure people knew who we were. And, sometimes we were doing too much. I mean, we were grilling and barbecuing in everybody's community, trying to get people to come out. And, we would, do some of the small problems instead of trying to show people how to do things themselves. So if their lights were out in their community, they would call us. And instead of us saying, well, let me tell you who to call. So, we didn't start off doing it the exact way that it probably should have been done. But I think now it's more of a philosophy where we really were trying to connect with people. I think
Hmm.
now it's more of just we do community policing.
Okay. And so, how long were you doing that before you made the next rank?
It took me, well, you can't take the sergeant's exams. You've been on for 5 years minimally. So
Okay.
I became a sergeant on my ninth year.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
And so, when you became a sergeant as a woman,
Hmm.
how many other females at the time were sergeants, if you recall?
Oh, I don't recall, but I will tell you, we've never really had a lot of female sergeants. I mean, we don't have a lot of female sergeants today.
Okay.
And so we had way less back then. It was definitely probably less than 10, if that many.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you took the test and you became a sergeant, did you feel like your colleagues treated you differently? Did you still have that same comfort level as far as your colleagues, or was it different because you were in a greater leadership role?
I think it was pretty much the same for me because one thing I can say is that, I'm pretty much who I am today as I was when I started. I mean, you will see some people, they change and their attitude changes as they start to get ranked, but I'm
Hmm.
pretty much the same person. So I didn't really have any different. I knew my responsibility was different, but
Hmm.
I didn't really have any different treatment and, people treating me differently because I had become a sergeant.
Okay. And so then from sergeant, what was educate us? What's the next rank you moved
Okay,
up?
so well, now it's sergeant, lieutenant,
Hmm.
captain, major,
Hmm.
deputy chief, and then I ended up as assistant chief. When I came through, we didn't have the rank of lieutenant.
Okay. And so assistant chief, what did that mean as far as a hierarchy? Second in command?
Correct.
Okay. And so I remember when that happened, and I'm not sure if this was my accurate recollection, but were you the first Black female assistant chief on the force?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so let's just talk plain now. That means that you surpassed a number of your male colleagues to get to that position. Um,
Yes.
what was the atmosphere like? Was it what you expected, or was it different?
Well, let me just say this. So when we got our first African American chief, back in I think it was 2008,
Hmm.
things changed for me then.
How so?
So yes, let me just say, I thought, with my rose colored glasses, I
Hmm.
thought that we were ready and accepting for an African American chief,
Which was Rodney
and
Monroe, for those of you
which
that
was
don't
right in
know.
the
Right.
row.
Okay.
I didn't see things start to happen until he came along. And, I became his right hand. I mean, that was kind of known, but that's because I supported him and I wanted him to be successful. And a lot of people were not happy about him being the chief. Now, whether it was he was African American, I don't know. But I will tell you that he went through a lot.
Hmm.
And me being right beside him, I know all those things. I know what happened. I know what people did. I know the letters they wrote. I know the things that they did. So for me, my problems began when I connected with him.
Hmm.
So obviously, when I became the first African American assistant chief, it didn't stop. It just went to times 10.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. So how did you cope with that? Well, let me ask you this before you answer that. Was that expected because of what you saw Chief Monroe go through, or was it um, amplified in a way that you really weren't expecting?
Well, because again, we're talking almost 10 years, of dealing with what I had seen and had been a part of. When people create blogs and they write every day about you and they take your picture wherever you are and they post it and they post lives about you every day for 8 years, by the time I became assistant chief, I expected nothing less than the things that occurred. And so it's so much stuff. I mean, we don't have the time in the day to get into all the different things that was done, the letters that were written, the things that were posted, the blogs, I mean, everything, just lives every day. I mean, people dedicated their life to that. And so I oftentimes say, now I see what celebrities feel and why they just have to let the stuff go and you can't fight every battle
Hmm.
and you just can't. So yes, it was magnified, but what can you do?
So how did you cope with that, other than
I
just not
cussed a
paying it
lot.
any attention?
I
Hmm.
cussed a lot.
Get
Um,
out of here! I would have never thought.
you know, let me just say, because I had been used to it for so long, I was okay. Um, I will say it's still disappointing because you always hope that, people would respect the fact that how hard it is, first of all, for a woman, period, to get to a high rank within an organization. And then in particularly an African American woman. And so, you hope that that's how it'll be, but it's not. And so, I coped with it the way I did. I do my job and I know my job
Hmm.
and I did my job well. And, I made decisions that were not popular sometimes and that people didn't like, but I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to do the right thing, treat people right, and do what I'm supposed to do.
Do you think? Do you think that as a woman, do you think that you were challenged more because you were a woman,
Oh,
or
absolutely.
okay?
Yeah,
Do you?
absolutely. I mean, women are going to always have it harder because it's a male dominated profession. And
Hmm.
so, in a lot of people's minds, that, the woman, doesn't know what it's like. And I'm like, no, you don't know what it's like, being a woman. And yes, did I have to be hard and strict? Yes, because unfortunately, when you're dealing with men, primarily men, you have to be the hard person. I mean, people will try to walk over you. And
Hmm.
so you have to establish who you are, and I've always done that without having to use rank as the thing that established me. It was Vicki. Like I'm Vicki first. So
Hmm.
I never had to pull the rank stuff and pull my shoulders and pop my collars and all of that. But people also knew that I didn't play and that, don't come at me the wrong way. So, you just have to establish yourself differently as a female.
Okay. So for those of you who are tuning in or just joining us, and you know Vicky, of course, drop a comment, say hey, because we can see you in the comments. If you have questions for her or for Keith Way, who's our next guest, and they'll be on together, make sure you drop a question in the comments because we can see that as well. So Renee, Ashley, Maurice, Beverly, Tariq, I see you. Thank you all for joining us. Question from Robert Corbett. Which is interesting. Why didn't you want to become the chief?
Because I'm smart. Um, Thanks, Barbara. That's a good question. Honestly, after all I have been through, just to be honest, to go through that for another 3 years, I didn't want to do that. And, I have an 82-year-old father, that I need to take care of. And so I'm all that he has. And so I didn't want to do it. I also didn't want my life to be consumed with giving speeches. And, every afternoon I'm at some community group doing this and that. I mean, I just kind of want to live. I've
Hmm.
had a very challenging career, and when you get to the point that you can let it go, I mean, I'm for the people that want to do it, I think that's great.
Hmm.
I know I could have done it, but I just didn't think that that was good for me in my life at this particular time.
What advice would you give to a young lady specifically who may be thinking about law enforcement? What would you tell her?
This is where I always get in trouble.
Girl, this
So
is a safe place. Say it.
I always get in trouble here. They had me to do a recruitment video like maybe 6 months before I left. And, I warned them. I said, okay, I'm
Are you
apparently not
sure?
the person you want to do a recruitment video. And they were like,
Right.
yes, Chief, we want you. I said, okay. Um, here's what I'll say. If it's in your heart and it's something that you are like, this is what I want to do. I want to, help people, and you understand that you're getting into a business that is, male dominated. There are a lot of people that are not going to like you just because of the uniform you wear. Then there's people that's not going to like you because you are a female African American in the uniform. And you may or may not get people at work that like you. You have to be a strong individual. So what I would say is it really has to be something you want to do. When you start off, it's not great pay. As you go up the ranks, it does become, very good. But you have to want to do this job. And I think today, in today's climate, it's going to be really hard. It's always been hard for us to get females anyway, and
Hmm.
particularly African American females. And there's different things. There's certain ways you can't wear your hair, and we're a different breed, and
Hmm.
so there's a lot of things that you can't do that we like to do, and so it's not very attractive to a lot of African American females. But what I would say is you got to really want to do it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of stuff you have to put up, and you have to be able to stand up, and you got to be able to speak out. And a lot of people have trouble doing that. So,
Okay. And so, if you can say one thing,
mhm.
maybe two, what do you think your two biggest challenges that you faced in your role as assistant chief? Or even not necessarily in that role, it could be when you were at a lower rank. What do you think maybe your two biggest challenges were, and how did you
Well,
overcome them?
okay, so at a lower rank, the biggest challenge is not being able to make change. And people, a lot of people, and sometimes I really wish people understand. They're like, well, how come these officers, don't speak up? And they don't realize that these officers don't have really any power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can they talk? Sure, but all that's going to do is aggravate the people that work with them, that back them up, that help keep them safe and alive. They don't have the power to make those changes. So the hardest part is when you're at a lower rank is not being able to make change. Now, once you start to go up the ranks, you can do that. And what I enjoyed was being in a position where I could change policy, things that weren't right. I could help make those things, happen and change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a challenge. And for me, so because I did not know how to respond well, and it'll be in the book. I told you when I saw something, I was an officer and I saw someone do something that I didn't approve of. And unfortunately, I almost tried to fight them inside of the house, inside of the search warrant.
Mm-hmm.
And I, in uniform, got taken away in the back seat of the patrol car.
What year was
And
that?
this was like somewhere between maybe 93, 94.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyway, the information made it to council and to the chief at the time. And he called me into his office and, he asked me what happened. And I said some things that, hey, I'm lucky probably still be here today.
Mm-hmm.
But I was that person and you can't expect that from everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was the person, if I see something, if I can't make the change like by policy, then, it wasn't the right thing to do, but I was going to make it another way. I made it for sure. I know one thing, he would never do nothing like that in front of me again. So,
Mm-hmm.
but everybody's not like that.
Okay. So, procedurally, now CMPD has directives. And some people aren't sure the difference between the directives that are available online versus policies, procedures, because this has become a hot topic in wake of how protesters were
Yeah.
treated during the protest. Obviously, everybody saw the footage of where they were surrounded and there was tear gas in the front and the back. When you see the directives, is that the overall policy of CMPD, or is that just part of it? And then there's more internal memos because people are trying to gauge, like, is this what they're supposed to be doing, or is there
Right.
inherently more to it?
Well, typically we don't have like internal memos that say don't do this or don't do that. Everything is either in the policy and the directives.
Okay.
So whatever is in that particular policy and directive, and it's funny because I went to the site a couple of months ago, and I'm not sure everything is listed. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure because we have a lot. And so, but that's what we go off of. We go off of the policies and directives. Internal memos are something that we rarely do, and it's really not about a something that's a policy.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
yes, whatever you see, that would be what we go by.
So, did you see the videos of what was happening with the protesters and the tear gas and all that? Were you able to see that?
Yeah, I did. It was probably a day or two later, but I did.
What was your first impression? Not asking for an expert opinion, but what was your first impression?
Well, I mean, I didn't really know what had happened. I was
Mm-hmm.
just trying to figure out, what had happened because every part of the clip that I kept seeing was really that same part. It was that
Mm-hmm.
same part of, people kind of, running in parking decks and, the blast on either end. And my big thing was, I'm like, okay, well, what happened? And
Right.
so, yeah, I mean, that was my first reaction is what happened for that to occur.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I remember when, and we'll get to this later because this is one of the questions that came up, but one of the questions I will pose, want you to give some thought to, because what city council and what the mayor talked about in her press conference about a week or 10 days or so ago was talking about reviewing the CMPD policies as far as how to deal with protests, the use of tear gas, that type of
Mhm.
thing. And when we talked about it that night on the show, the thing that struck me is when I looked up the directive, it was just a paragraph and it wasn't much to it other than you shouldn't basically use pepper spray or physical control methods unless there's an imminent threat to the officer's safety. That I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of what it said. So I
Pepper
think
spray or tear gas?
OC spray.
Oh, sea spray, not tear gas. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah, it only refers to OC spray and physical control methods. It's
Hmm.
very vague. It doesn't say, it doesn't use the term tear gas at all. It's just physical control methods,
Hmm.
whatever that means. So that was one of the questions that was posed, but I'll ask when I have both Keith and you up here in terms of, well, what does that mean when we're talking about an imminent threat and peaceful protest? Because I think that's the controversy, because the clip that you see tear gas coming from behind, but the protesters had already passed the officers and were in the alleyway before they turned to try to run, but they can't run because there's tear gas there. But we're gonna come
Hmm.
back to that.
Hmm.
I have a question from Tariq, but I'm gonna go ahead and pose it to you, but I don't want to go into too much detail because I think we're gonna talk about it in a little bit
Okay.
anyway. But he wanted to know what was your plan for changing the climate and the tension between the police and the public. Obviously, you're not in the role as assistant chief now, but you have
Right.
posted on your lives, on your social media, in terms of some of the things that people can start to do now. And Keith
Yeah.
has some ideas as well as far as police reform. So, without getting into too much of that, because I want to spend some
Yes.
time on that,
Yeah.
in general, what would be the plan for changing just the climate and the tension between the police and the public?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, I really think it goes back to the way we used to police a long time ago. We got to all come together, sit down, be open, and it's very hard for both sides to be open because police, we're, protective, overprotective of each other, oftentimes. And then the community is the same way. And so we have to come together and really talk about what are the things that are causing, harm in the community. What are the things you all are concerned about? Because we have in our ability to make changes to policies and procedures. But what I would tell people is, policies and procedures are one step. But the reality of it is, what you really want is a change in people's attitude, and you want a change in how people treat people. And that's two different things. And so to me, that's where the biggest rub comes. People say all day, well, give them more training and, racial, equity training. And, I tell people this all the time. At the end of the day, you can't change someone's heart. And what we're talking about, honestly, is changing how people either feel about a group of people or how they feel about their experiences with a group of people. And so that's why we have to come together and we have to be real. We have to allow people to say the things that probably each side don't want to hear. And I
Mm-hmm.
think until those really hard conversations are had, because I've been to so many forums until I can't even tell you how many, and we just really want to vent. And we need to be able to go in and say specifically what our problems are. Not everybody wants to give their story of their encounter with the police. You got to go in and talk about, here's some things that I think specifically could happen that would help us. And then we got to be honest and tell you what we can do
Mm-hmm.
and what we can't do.
Okay. So I'm gonna have you hold that thought, and
Mhm.
because we're gonna come back also in terms of what it means as far as disciplining officers and some of the major hurdles that obviously the chief has, and even disciplining officers that I think a lot of
Yes.
people don't know. We'll come back
Yes.
to that. So
Yeah.
if you are just joining us, make sure if you have questions, make sure you drop them in the comments. I can see them. Vicki can see them. Keith can see them, and we'll obviously try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Also, if you're happening to catch this on a replay, feel free to share it, and you can also ask us questions or pose questions by email at theconvopodshow@gmail.com, because this series is a 5-part series, and we'll continue to kind of deal with some of these issues at the end, and then we're going to have a wrap-up session where we're going to have most of our guests back, and we're going to tackle some of the issues that have happened since then. So, Vicki, I need you to stick around
Yes,
because we're going to
ma'am.
get into the heart of some of the issues that have happened in the last few days. But I want to have both you and Keith on so I can get both of you all's
Sure.
perspectives because they're very unique. So our next guest is someone that I have known for quite some time. I think my first encounter with him was back in court. Oh gosh, I can't even remember the old domestic violence courtroom in the courthouse. But certainly Detective Way, now retired, has been a stronghold in the community in many ways for many years. Some of you all know him from Right Moves for You. Some of you all know him in the community, as a community liaison. Some of you all know him in his role as a detective. I'm not going to go into all of his history because he's going to tell you about some of that. But he brings a very different perspective in his role as a detective, specifically working with domestic violence cases and things of that nature. And he too has had some really great ideas in wake of everything that is going on in terms of how we can address police reform in a meaningful way and some of the things that we can do as far as policies. And given the fact that his experience has kind of run the gamut in terms of being community driven and of course being on the force as well, I think he gives us a very unique perspective. So welcome Detective Keith Way to the show. How you
That's right.
doing?
Get
Right.
get it right. Retired.
Retired with a big R. Yes. How you doing this evening, sir?
Capital R. Aura. Aura. I'm doing well.
Well, listen, thank you
Retirement has
for.
been good. It's something I look forward to.
Well, I'm glad to have you on
Go
the
ahead.
show, and thank you for taking the time to join us. Are you able to hear me? It seems like there's a little bit of delay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Great. All right. So your role on Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department has been very much community driven before you moved to the role as being a detective. So I'll ask you at least initially the same question I asked Vicki. Why did you choose law enforcement to begin with?
I didn't choose it. It chose me.
What do you mean?
My dad's best friend was the he used to be a sergeant in recruiting, and he saw me at our house one day, and he was trying to convince me to come to the police department. Well, in the interim, he ended up becoming the chief over the park rangers.
Mm-hmm.
So he started out recruiting me for the police department, but then he moved me over to the park rangers, and I went to work for him there. And that's how I started my career.
And so when you started, what division were you in?
When I transferred over, I went in the academy in '88, and I worked for the park rangers from '88 to '92, and then I transferred to the police department in '92, and I was working in Baker 3, which pretty much encompassed Independence, Greertown, Cherry, you know, um, parts of Providence Road, Randolph Road, Sharon Amity. So I worked over there for a year.
Did you have the same experience that Vicki mentioned as far as doing more community policing and versus what it is now?
Yes, I was in the second group of community police coordinators. So we saw what worked with the first group, and so we kind of rewrote the book with our group.
Mm-hmm.
And I had probably what at the time what some people thought was one of the most um, toughest neighborhoods to police, and that was Dalton Village.
Mm-hmm.
But I had nothing but love in Dalton Village. They loved me, and I loved them.
Okay. And so how did it change then?
And so what happened? Well, for us, what we did was I didn't try and police the whole neighborhood. There were only a handful that needed to be dealt with, and that's all I concentrated on. And then the rest of my career was trying to. I didn't want to be a man. I wanted to teach people how to fish.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime I had knowledge and I could share it with the community, that's what I did.
And do you find so what was the change then? Why do you think the focus on community policing changed?
Well, like Vicki said, it's just a philosophy now. With us, a lot of the coordinators back then, we actually had ties to the community. If you look at a lot of people that's being recruited now, they're coming from everywhere else. They don't really have any ties to Charlotte. They're here for a paycheck and a career. We had ties. We had people that growing up in Charlotte. Charlotte was a community, especially in the Black community. We all knew each other. And so we had those connections. But now it's just, when I look at coordinators, they're all so young. And it's almost like no one's really taught them how to be a coordinator, taught them how to connect with the community.
And so, okay, well, given that was the
Take this thing off.
circumstances then, you need a second, sir? Is that better?
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay. And so, because I
I'm good.
remember when we were talking at the beginning before you came on air that you also worked with Right Moves for Youth and the Police Athletic League before you decided to become a detective. Was that something that you've always been interested in as far as that community engagement, or were you just kind of tapped to do that type of work? Your mic is muted.
Okay.
Okay.
So for me, it was natural going to Right Moves for Youth. I was actually tapped to by the command staff
Mm-hmm.
because of the work I had done in so many communities, and they wanted a change in the program. So I was actually handpicked to
Mm-hmm.
go there. And the years I was there, we actually had some of the greatest successes that programs ever had. With keeping kids in school and also occupying their after school and out of school time. We had really great successes.
And so I'm gonna ask you this, and I asked this of Vicki from a female's perspective. You are a black man with a blue uniform and a badge. What do you think the when do you think it was the first time that you really experienced racism in your role as an officer? Can you hear me?
Um,
Oh,
in the academy,
okay.
in the academy, there were only four of us in the entire class, and it was just I experienced it not only as a black man, but coming in, not working for the Charlotte Police Department at that time. It's just a lot of stuff that was done to me that just wasn't done to other employees.
Like what?
Well, it was, um, of course, it was always the extra push-ups, the extra running. It was always something about my work. It was almost like they were trying to push me out of the academy. And on the day of graduation, our class commandant came over to me and he told me, he said, I really didn't think you were going to make it. I did everything I could, but you have a lot of intestinal fortitude. And those
Wow.
were his exact words that he told me.
Wow. So how
And
did
I
you
pretty
react to that?
much had that same battle for almost 30 years.
And do you think it's inherently based on the perception? Let's just keep it real because that's what we do here on a conversation. Do you think it's the perception of just black masculinity and an intimidation factor for that, or do you think it is rooted in something else within the department itself? And I don't mean to be vague in that question, but I'm just, do you know what I'm saying as far as the difference?
Well, I actually worked in a district where we really thought that the officers that work with us didn't want any black officers.
Okay.
That's the way it just was. They just appeared that any black officers in that district. So you have the history of CMPD because I remember growing up when black officers could only arrest black people. They couldn't arrest anyone white.
What?
And
Say
you had
that.
a lot of
Wait,
those,
wait,
a lot
wait,
of
wait,
them.
wait. What? Say that again.
There was a time in Charlotte police where, as a black officer, you could not arrest a white person. You could only police and arrest people in the black community. That's in Charlotte's history.
Wow. Okay. And so when did it change?
Started to change a little bit after the desegregation, after desegregation came in the cities. But you have to remember that black officers had the Charlotte Police Department just to get promotions in the 80s, just to
Mm.
get promoted.
Hmm.
And so you had a lot of holdovers that were deeply rooted in the department and they wielded a lot of power. And that was a problem.
And so, outside of that particular experience when you left the academy, and of course, what you had to deal with during the 30 years that you were on the department, what made you decide that you wanted to, one, become a detective, and two, your focus being on domestic violence, being a part of that unit?
Well, I actually wrote a paper. It's the only published paper on how to determine who's going to be a domestic violence victim before she's assaulted. I work with the Police Executive Research Forum, and I came up with a formula using an existing police system to determine with 90% accuracy who's going to be a victim. And I wrote that on a friend of mine who was a chronic domestic violence victim.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was published, got the Goldstein Award, which is the highest problem solving award in America. And it was just a natural progression. We had a couple domestic violence homicides. You know, we run the gamut of, we have these spurts of domestic related homicides. And the chief said that he wanted someone in every district looking over those cases. So it was just my cap, like, you're the most logical choice because you have the most experience with domestic violence over anyone else in the district.
Mm.
And then one day he just walked in my office and he laid a detective's badge on my desk and he said, "You're a detective now, go detect." That's all I was told.
Get out of here, Keith. Really?
That's true story. I actually posted the picture of where he laid my badge on my desk. And I said, well, my captain told me I was a detective. I'm unofficially a detective, but I'm a detective. And he told me, he laid the badge down. He said, here's your badge. You're a detective, go detect. And that's all they told me.
Wow. Okay. So a couple questions before I bring you both back on. So in wake of COVID, what I've seen and what seems to be true is that, well, it's not seems to be, it is true that we've seen a dramatic increase in domestic violence, obviously due to quarantine and any number of things. More specifically in domestic violence protective order cases, but also in, whether it's simple assault or assault on a female cases. What advice, if any, could you give to a woman or a man? Because we have to be clear that men are victims of domestic violence as well. It's just, that's just not a perception, but it's very much true. What advice would you give to somebody who's in a situation where they feel like they can't get out?
The best advice I can tell them is talk to someone, seek some assistance. A lot of times people don't know where to turn, where to go. It's a lot of times what I saw was people would tell me a lot of things, but prove any of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always, even to this day, I still receive 2 to 3 domestic violence calls from advocates who I work with, and they call me and ask me info over the officers who are working for CMPD.
Mm.
And I'll tell them, have you tried this organization? Have you tried that organization? You need to have them to reach out to here. Have you done these things? And it's really interesting because COVID has really exposed a lot in our lives. And with domestic violence, it's only going to get worse the longer we stay under this stay at home and this COVID. So it's just going to get worse. And we need to make sure that information sharing is key. And that's something the city has never been good at, and that's sharing information.
So offhand, and I'm going to ask you this one. I'm going to ask you this in a second because I see several questions. For those of you who are just tuning in, if you have questions, make sure you drop them in the comments. I'll definitely get to as many questions as I can because we do want to get to the heart of some of the issues regarding the thin blue line. But specifically, I want to address Mike's question. And this is a good one because this is a frustration that many people have, and I frankly have had as well. Like, we have these community relations forums between the police and the community, and it seems like they're always sending the black cops to be a part of the discussion in terms of bridging the gap in communities, and rarely do they bring a cross section of what the department actually looks like. And I think that's true to some extent, but that was definitely true post Keith Lamont Scott with the many of the forums that I attended. It was the same faces. and probably not the faces that should have been in the room to hear some of the things that were actually said by members of the community. Now, you may not have a direct answer in terms of why particular people are chosen, but why do you think it's important to, if important, if any, to have a cross section of what the actual community looks like when we have these community discussion forums?
Well, for me, the way I look at it is, number one, the problem that I see with those same people is that internally, when I look back on their history, most of them have been off the street for 10, 15 years. So they really don't even have a clue of what's going on in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And you couple that with there is no cross section of officers. The key is, in the way we used to do it back in the early 90s, it is many officers, white and black, there. So we had a cross section of information. So we can, if I couldn't answer it, someone else could. And to be honest, people get tired of seeing the same people, because if they're not sat with them the first time, when they see them 4 or 5 times, they pretty much tune them out. And, but we should also be giving other officers an opportunity to share in the information sharing that needs to go on in our community, so that we can, this is how you building up officers, the future officers, to have those relationships. If it's the same 3 or 4 people, nobody cares about them. Even when I would get invites as a detective, I would always try and take a coworker, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. I would always try and take someone else with me to give them the opportunity to see and hear what the community had to say.
Okay. Now, this question came up a couple of times. The paper that you mentioned that you wrote, as far as the likelihood of someone becoming a victim of domestic violence, where can someone find that? Is there a website that we can share or drop in the comments that people can be able to read that paper? Because he mentioned that he had some family members he was concerned about.
It's on the Police Executive Research Forums page. It's under the Problem Solving Quarterly, and it came out in spring of 2003, and it was volume 6, number 1. I have a copy of it right here, so I'll make sure you get
is
share
there a
it
website?
with your fans.
Is there a website that I can direct people to that they can find it that way?
Yes, Police Executive Research Forum.
Like www police executive.
And I don't know if com or net or whatever, but you can Google it, and it's on there. And the whole paper that I wrote was, not only can we identify who the victim is, but we use the way we log the victim.
Mm-hmm.
We went from the victim being an address location to the actual victim being the hotspot. And I tracked them around the city. We have 13 different districts. So if she has 5 different cases, 5 different officers will be working on it. And I propose that one officer works all those cases.
Okay. And last question before I have both of you up here. What advice would you give to a young black man who is interested in becoming a law enforcement officer? What advice would you give him?
Get with, I always tell people, you don't have to like all of CMPD, but you need to have a relationship with one, because some things that you need to know, such as your driving, your criminal record, your credit, the friends you do, drug use. Drug use is an automatic disqualifier. People don't realize you can't be a police officer if you have 6 points, because you can't be insured. These are things that our kids don't get a chance to hear. So if they had a relationship with an officer who could tell them those things and guide the process, I think we could then see more men not only come into law enforcement, but they would have successful careers. Mm-hmm. And that's what we had back then. We had mentors who guided us through the process, and we don't see a lot of that today.
Okay. And can people reach out to you if they have an interest to you via social media or an email address?
Yes. I am Keith, Keith Way, Way.
And do you is there an email address, or you prefer just through social media?
They can email me at this email is keithway@hotmail.com.
Hotmail
I
Keith.
actually keep that email. Yeah, I keep that email because a lot of my victims still contact me through Hotmail.
Okay. And that's
You have
keithway
to
at
remember, I have
hotmail.com.
victims that I've worked with since 2000. Yes,
Okay, so keithway at
that's it.
hotmail.com. All right. So if anybody
Yeah.
has questions, if they're interested in becoming a police officer, or in regard in terms of domestic violence, then they can contact you there. Good to that. So that works for you.
Yes.
All right. So I want to get back to, so I'm bring Vicki Foster back on, because what I want to get to is the heart of the three topics I really wanted to touch base with tonight. First, let's deal with the issue.
Hey, Vicki.
Oh,
Hey,
by
hi.
the way, hey y'all. So
Hey.
first
Hello.
big
Hallelujah.
First big legal issue. Supreme Court decides not to take on the case that would deal with the issue of qualified immunity. I believe one of the questions specifically from Kim Ratliff, she asked, what are your thoughts on qualified immunity for police officers? Because the Supreme Court had decided not to take up the case with the Supreme Court that would have addressed that issue head on. Ironically, Justice Sotomayor and Justice Clarence Thomas, of all people, were some of the largest proponents of having that case brought up, but we're not going to have a resolution to that as of now. It's still going to lie in the Court of Appeals or in state court. Qualified immunity, for those of you who are just joining us, does not allow a police officer, with some narrow exceptions of civil rights violations, but in general, qualified immunity means that a police officer cannot be sued personally for acts of misconduct that happen during the course of their employment. And in general, police departments, with many exceptions, cannot necessarily be held liable. Now, how that's defined is defined by, if it's a state court issue, then state cases will define that. But if it's what we call a 1983 claim or a civil rights action, it's defined a little bit differently. For both of you, and I'll start with you, Vicki, what are your thoughts on qualified immunity for police officers?
Well, I was just asked this question the other day, and I said it takes so long to answer. I'll try to be as brief as possible.
We ain't on no time limit. Go for it,
Yeah,
girl.
I'll try. Look, I'll try to be brief. So, I have mixed feelings about it. Obviously, coming from both sides of the track, being on both sides. One of the things that I think a revision is needed. I don't necessarily think it needs to be done away with, but it does need a revision, because right now it's just if it's civil rights violations or certain constitutional violations. And I think what bothers most people, including myself, is that when we clearly see someone that does something wrong, and then they can't be held personally liable for it. And I think that's the piece that really upsets people. I mean, I think there is a need for qualified immunity. However, it has to be based upon, only if a person has not done something such as what we've seen over the last, many years, not even just the last couple of weeks. So for me, because you do have to remember, when someone's taking on this job, they take on a huge risk. And so if you do away with it, and not to say, listen, some people be like, well, who cares? Get rid of all the police. I hear all of that, but it's not realistic. And so you do have to have some form of protection in order to do your job safely for yourself and to protect your family. But I do think there needs to be revision, because I do feel when someone does something egregious, and some of the things that we're seeing, I do think that they need to be able to be held, liable personally. So that's where the difference is. It's such a fine line. That's something that would have to take a lot of talking and a lot of, let's really look at this to the detail. But that's part of the reason for it, is that it's a job that, you could get sued for anything. I mean, not to talking about the egregious stuff. And so that's why I say it's such a large field. You have to kind of narrow it down and focus more on those things that we all really care about, and those things that we really believe need to be held accountable for.
Okay. Keith, do you want to chime in on that?
I agree with Vicki. She's absolutely right. In law enforcement, it's never the same. You can go through, you same incident, and everyone's different because everyone will react different. I believe that there are some instances where, you know, qualified immunity should be taken away. Case in point, the Minneapolis case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was just, I mean, you can't even say anything, and yet still, you know, there'll probably be some form of some immunity on the back end for him and his personal properties and things like that. I mean, depending on what Minnesota law states, but I mean, in those instances like that, we have to do something to protect the public. And, you know, it's just, I don't know. Some people get in law enforcement for the wrong reasons. And, you know, we can't let them hide behind qualified immunity. And that's what a lot are doing. They're hiding behind it.
Well, and unfortunately, in George Floyd's case, Chauvin, and well, obviously his attorneys are now looking at a civil suit because it came out obviously that in Minnesota, he still would be eligible for his pension at 55, upwards of about $50,000 a year, with a estimated value of about 1.5 million. So whether or not that will be protected in a civil suit obviously is a question for another day. But that reality, and I think you both make the point, is that there has to be some protection because it erodes public confidence in the police, especially when we continue to see the same things that are happening all the time and without any consequence. So, main question for both of you: what is in fact the thin blue line, and does it really exist? Who wants to take that one first? Let's get to it.
How about it, Keith?
My answer may not be popular.
Okay.
My answer is the thin blue line. It used to be a brotherhood. Now it is a militia type. It's a militia type
What do you mean? Be specific.
atmosphere. I just know what I went through. I know what I went through my career, and Vicki can spank me later. Probably retired as the most investigated officer in the history of CMPD to never go to not for anything major. It was always
Wait.
something minor. So I went
Okay.
through a lot of investigations. I went through a lot of investigations. I went through CMPD, county, police department, SBI, FBI, DEA, ATF, and Secret Service, Treasury. And to this day, I've still not been questioned on anything I was accused of. But it was part of that thin blue line. They had their idea of me. And so they stuck with it, and there was nothing I could do to turn it off. So imagine how the public feels when they have absolutely no recourse to fight.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, for me, I just watched a lot go down, and I lost a lot of respect for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the thin blue line is they can say what they want, but a lot of people of color are not included in the thin blue line.
Okay.
That's just
Vicki?
my opinion. That's my personal opinion. That's not the department's opinion. It's anyone else's.
So real talk before you answer that, Vicki, because there was when all of this kind of came to the forefront, and you would kind of hear about it in the media, and it was like, oh, that's why you see the bumper stickers with the blue line, and all of that became popular. Even if you weren't a police officer, people were copping these bumper stickers because they thought it
That's
was
what they're
going to
trying
help
to not
them.
get tickets. Yeah.
Right, because they were like, oh, I'm good because somebody's
Right.
gonna see me and
Yeah.
let me go.
Right.
But Vicki, from your perspective, and particularly from a female's perspective, do you agree that that line doesn't necessarily exist for for black officers, or not? And then how does it encompass female officers as well?
So obviously, I can only speak from my perspective as well, like Keith did. I think the thin blue line, as Keith said, it was and is a brotherhood, and it's supposed to be a family. Is really what it's supposed to be. And somewhere along the way, I think we've lost a lot of that. I'll be the first to say that things are always different for people of color in a police department. Now, you'll get a lot of people that won't agree with that, but they're usually not the people of color. And
Mm-hmm.
so, things are different for, African Americans within the police department. It's different for a female. I mean, if you look at life, African American female is at the absolute bottom of the totem pole. And so when you end up climbing to the top of almost the totem pole inside of an organization, there are some people that don't feel like you should be there. And so the thin blue line, yes, it's there. And people look after each other in what realm that may be. But does everyone feel the same way about the thin blue line? Probably not. I always try to be supportive of everyone within the organization, but can I say that that's the same thing that was returned to me? No. And, Keith's experience is different from my experience. I haven't had any investigations, but, he also probably had 8 years of people blogging about you and telling lies every day. So, it's different for each person. And
Yeah.
so everybody, has what they've gone through. And yeah, I mean, did I think people should have investigated the people that were doing the stuff to me? And it was all fine until it started happening to them. Then they wanted to do an investigation. But so I listen. It is not the same for everybody. No, it's not.
Okay. And so let's first start with the George Floyd case. In terms of the office, obviously Chauvin being charged with second degree and the manslaughter charge, and then of course the other officers being charged with aiding and abetting. One of the questions that's often asked, and Attorney Corbett asked, does the thin blue line also encompass this concept that officers are afraid, particularly lower ranked officers are afraid to say anything because of fear of reprisal or fear of saying something to a ranking officer because they're afraid that they're going to be disciplined and the ranking officer is not, which is what some of the argument was, or at least the media spin in the George Floyd matters, that you had two inexperienced officers and more experienced officers, and they were, in theory, afraid to say anything to Chauvin because he was the officer with 20 years experience. Does that encompass a thin blue line, or is that more of a um, environment that's ingrained into that particular department, or just something you see in general?
Well, I'd like to let Keith answer that first, and then I speak on it from maybe a ranking position. But I'd like for him to answer that first.
Okay, Keith, what do you think?
Well, I do know that when you're in field training, your field training officer is, they like to make you feel like they're God to you. They hold your career in the palm of their hand. So you will do what that person tells you to do, because at the stroke of a pen, they could ultimately shelve your career. I don't think it's so much of punishment, it's the retaliation that you'll get from your peers. Um, I just know personally, a whole my whole shift left me hanging when I got out with a guy who was wanted for a homicide.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody would come and back me up. So that's the type of retaliation that you have to deal with. When you hear officers say, "Hey, where are all the good guys? Why don't they say anything?" Our job is a life and death situation, and sometimes you have to think about self-preservation. Yes, it happens. It does happen. You can always come on a scene. A sergeant can overrule you. A senior officer can overrule you. They can tell you what to do, and they can make your life miserable. But it also goes down to each person standing in that department. Some people are liked better than people. No matter what they say, it's believed. So those are realities that you deal with in law enforcement.
And so,
And I'll
Keith,
let
well, Keith, no,
Vicki
I want you to
go.
stay there for a second because I want to ask you something on a more personal level. You jokingly talk about how literally, it seems like almost every agency has some sort of investigation. What does that do for your psyche, though? Because at some point, either you feel like, okay, enough is enough, but how do you do? Because I asked the same question to Vicki, like, how do you deal with people talking about you, blogging about you, all of that? But how do you deal with that from an investigative standpoint of feeling like you've been through all of these various investigations? Obviously, you came through with with no major issues as far as your job is concerned. But what does that do for you as an officer, and
Mm.
frankly, as a black male officer?
It makes look at people differently, who you can trust and who you can't trust. The even to this day, the amount of police officers that I may talk to them on Facebook, on social media, but there's only about 5 or 6 that I deal with personally and that I'll even meet with. It just changed my whole psyche. I just came up with the my thought was either I didn't do it or I was smarter than everybody in the department. That's what it all boiled down to. I didn't do it or I was smarter than everybody. And I know I didn't do it, so I go. And I'm not gonna leave on you want me to go. It's not gonna happen. And even when I retired, I refused to let them give me a retirement party. I said, don't stand up in my face like you my friend when you weren't my friend before. The attitude I had in a lot of situations, there were a lot of things I had to do on my own. But because I had a great relationship with the community, there were times when I would get on a traffic stop and the people in the community would come out and watch my back. That was crazy. But, I mean, did it affect me? Yeah, it affects me to this day because it makes me wonder who I can and can't trust. My own best friend in the police department turned his back on me. And since then I've probably said 10 words to him. That goes.
Did you have any similar experiences as well, Vicki?
Well, the one thing I can say is nobody nobody really appreciates people when they speak up. I mean, some people do. I shouldn't say nobody. That's not fair. But yes, I mean, I've had a similar experience. I've had similar experiences. The one that sticks out in particular is shortly after I kind of, made my little melee about what I saw and that I felt like this was done because this person was an elderly African American woman. I would go on a call and every once in a while they would push that button that says at scene. And I'm like, and nobody was there. And so, you have a choice at that point. You could get on the air and say, hey, Adam 102 or whatever, they're not here. Or, because if you do that, you're going to make it worse. And so people don't really understand how it all works. So you either handle the call by yourself or, you have people that are your people on the ship and they're going to come and check on you. You send them a message. We used to have this thing where you could private call people. And so you could private call people and say, hey, come help me out. They pushed the button, they're not here. And so that's why I tell people they have to be careful about when they say, well, why don't officers speak up or whatever? These are people's lives. And I mean, I get that they want now. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think I know a police officer that would allow for someone to hurt someone like that. And they're standing there watching and not do anything. But that's internal stuff. So even when people on the news are like, why don't they speak up? They have no idea what's going on inside these agencies because people do complain on other people. Our officers actually complain more internally on other officers than citizens do on us. So I think it's unfair sometimes because people don't realize, I guess they want people on social media or the television or whatever, but these people have to realize these people have to be backed up. They want to go home. And so there's a different side to that people tend to forget about because they're not in the business. And so I tell people, they wonder why people wait till they're retired to speak out and about the things that are going on. And it's because it is a different culture, and don't get me wrong, I spoke up a lot, but I paid for it too. I paid for it dearly, with the stress level. And and everybody don't want to deal with that.
And so Renee asked, you already answered her question, but she wanted to know if there were any reprisals that retired officers would face by speaking up or expressing their concerns.
No, I had someone say the other day, well, they don't speak up because they'll lose their pension. Let me explain something to you. Come try to get this pension if you want. So I'm just saying that we're not worried about that. I think a lot of people, and Keith may feel differently, but I think when a lot of people get out of it, they just get out of it. I mean, they try not to, like for me, I have really tried to stay out of it. I don't know why all this stuff is happening, but I've tried to stay out of it because it's something that you want to just be able to move on with your life. And then too much I know too much to not say anything. And so, I just think it doesn't have anything to do with retired officers. Listen, I had a retired officer call me last week. He'd been retired for 10 years, and he wanted to talk to me about how he was never recognized for his work, and yet people that didn't look like him were recognized for things much less. He'd been retired for 10 years. People are hurting that felt like they were treated differently. But if you try to tell people in the department that those things hurt people and they really happen, if you haven't experienced it, you just don't know. And here's what I always say. People forget when the tables turned, when we got our first African American chief. Okay, well, prior to that, I couldn't walk in the chief's office and say, "Hey, how you doing?" and whatever. And I dealt with that for 20 some years. And I had to learn to live with that. And that's okay. But when the tables turned and now I can walk in the office and say, "Hey, chief, how you doing?" The whole department goes crazy. And I'm like, it's okay when you're comfortable with the chief and you can do that. And, me or who people that look like me, don't have that same opportunity. But when it switches over and now we can go in there and have that opportunity, all hell breaks loose. And so I just try to remind people, take a look at what other people went through that you have no knowledge of. Everybody's gone through something, and in particular, African Americans.
And so Renee asked another question that I think
Exactly.
is really good. She said, what can citizens do to support police officers or police groups that are seeking reform?
Very good question. Well, I mean, and here's just my opinion, and I'm sure Keith has some better suggestions. So here's what happens. And I get it. Citizens get very, very upset with us, and rightfully so. So understand what I'm saying. I understand that. But citizens groups have to be able to come together, bring us, we all come together with the citizens group. And we got to be able to talk to each other about real issues. And I've said this before, we never get anywhere because we want to yell, we want to scream, we want to fuss about what happened to us or what happened to our son or our daughter. And we don't ever get anything accomplished. We need citizens groups to come together and seriously write down things that they think are issues that can be changed. A lot of people are going to say training, and we need to talk to them about what training we get and what training they think that we need. I mean, listen, we've been de-escalated from the bottom to the top, and I know people don't believe that, but again, we're talking about changing something much deeper than showing somebody de-escalation. And I know that that's a word that we've now tossed around, but sometimes it's not realistic. We got to really come together. Citizens groups have to come together and say, here's some things we want to talk about, and we want you all to tell us what we need to do, and we're going to talk to you about what we would like to see from you all. And let me just say this last little thing. One of the things people always say is, well, back when police lived in the neighborhood, we ain't had this problem. We hear that all the time. But look, let's be realistic, okay? Most of the police officers, the majority of them live out of county for a lot of reasons. Some of it is taxes and so forth. People want to live where they want to live, and they don't want to live where someone's going to come knock on their door every time they have a problem. I think people forget that we also don't want to be 24/7. So some of the suggestions that citizens groups have, they're great suggestions, but they need someone there to explain to them why it won't happen. And so the neighborhoods that need us the most, you probably not gonna get a police officer that wants to live there. And I'm just being completely honest. And so that's why we have to come together, throw out those things, and let's talk about why. Or let's talk about, can it happen? What do we need to do to make it happen? So to me, it's all about dialogue and then action, because we do a lot of stuff and then we don't do it. And that's on both sides.
Keith, you want to jump in on that?
And I think what to piggyback on what Vicki was saying, one of the things I always tried to do in my career is when people to help the police department, support the police department, always push them to the Citizens Academy. And I said, you can't really help us if you don't know how we operate. And so the ones that went through the Citizens Academy always told me that it opened their eyes to things that they didn't know. But also, when you join these group organizations, a lot of times they need to have someone, what I hear sounds good, but it's not feasible. It's not manpower efficient. It's not money efficient. It's just not how we do business efficient. Sometimes we have state and federal guidelines that prohibit us from doing a lot of the things that they want. So I'm saying, bring in a retiree or bring in someone who's been there who can take these 100 ideas you have and whittle them down to 10 good ones, because I'd rather see 10 good ideas worked on than everybody screaming with 100. Vicki said, nothing ever gets done. Everybody's screaming, everybody's yelling, everybody's cussing, and now everyone walks away frustrated, and that's been the norm of what we've seen.
Okay, so I want to stay with George Floyd's case for one more major question, and then I want to get to the Brooks matter. But why is it so difficult? And I'm going to talk in general, but specifically Charlotte. Why is it so difficult to discipline officers who are problematic? Why is it so difficult to discipline them? And why is it so easy for them to go to another county and just pop up over there and continue whatever it is that they're doing?
So I can tell you from being over human
That's a
resources.
Vicki question.
Unfortunately, yeah, I can tell you from well, one, from being a supervisor, but then also from being over human resources for many years. So part of the problem is documentation. So here's what happens: people don't always document people's behaviors. And so, in order for us to discipline someone and hold them accountable at first for their performance, it has to be documented. Now, it's like that in probably every organization. However, ours is a little different because so much of sometimes the stuff is behavior, it's attitude, it's how you speak to people. It's things like that that are building that people are not documenting. So there's so many times that we go and we pull out the person's personnel file, their performance evaluation for the previous year, and they got excellent. I mean, almost every, if you listen, you let us tell it, everybody excellent. Like nobody wants to give people what they truly deserve, because one, it impacts their money. And so, two, they want the supervisors, and this is a piece that I always have a problem with. Supervisors want to be liked. And I guess that's why, I became who I was, because I really didn't care if you like me or not. As long as my mom and daddy like me, I don't care. But so people want to be liked. And so they would not do the documentation, number one. So if you don't have the documentation and you've been giving them great ratings for the last couple of years in their performance appraisal, you already knocked out of the box right there. Now, the second part of it is, we have fired, terminated people, and we have a civil service here. And so for those people that don't know, it's the Civil Service Board. They review certain things. They review hiring, promotions, things like that, and terminations. We have actually sent people to the Civil Service Board, and they've sent them back. Now, we have determined this person does not need to be on this police department. And for whatever reason, through civil service, you have all types of people on the board. You got people that love cops. You got people that hate cops. You got people that may not like the current chief. And so I'm going to go against whatever he says. But at the end of the day, it impacts the community. And so we've sent people back that we've had to put in positions that we don't want them on the street. So we put them in some other position, which is not fair to the other people because they're getting paid the same salary. So it goes back to several things. It's civil service, which is some, that's not all of them, but civil service is the issue. They have civil service protection. And then the second piece is, we don't do a good job at documenting behaviors. We just don't. So, and that's a huge problem, because sometimes you can tell a person's attitude, but how do you, without seeming like, you got to have something. Like somebody might come in every day and that they don't talk right to citizens. But unless the citizens complain, or an officer comes to you and tells you, you can't just say, I know this fool right here got a bad attitude here on the street. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know who them fools are. I do. But the reality of it is, how am I going to do anything about that? Like, somebody has to complain, because I, as the supervisor, can then turn around and look like, oh, well, you just don't like him. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard.
Okay. And so this is a personal question for me, because when I was at the public defender's office, I taught American criminal courts over at UNCC as an adjunct. And I'm not going to say his name because I hope he's retired, but he may still be there. But I had an officer who was on the street at that time, white male, and I will never forget this, y'all. It still sticks with me to this day. We were talking about policing in general, and then I asked him, we were talking statistics, and I said something to the effect that, statistics in many cases can be, manipulated. And this was before the whole concept of over policing. It still wasn't like a concept then. Sure. But he said something that struck me and stuck with me. He said, well, we were always taught that we always cast our nets where we can catch the most fish. And that struck me because I was like, okay. He said, so if we know that we can cast our nets off of Beatty's Ford Road and get 10 arrests versus casting our nets and not and going over to Myers Park, we're going to cast our nets where we can get the most fish, because people don't know. They don't know that you don't have to respond to a knock and talk. They
Mm-hmm.
don't know what their rights are,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of being able to say no, or you don't. If it's not a voluntary contact, have a warrant, or have something else other than that. But that struck me, and that was probably what 2000. I'm gonna say 2003, no later than 2004.
Sure.
And the next time I saw him, he was a ranking officer, and so I always wondered, I wonder if he still teaches that. Like, is that something that he teaches his subordinates, or did he evolve in his thinking? And the couple of times I saw him, he was too far away to where I could even like get to him or ask him. But it struck me that he was at that time, and I believe he was a captain or a step below a captain. But he was up there. I know it was a goal. I know it was gold. Whatever it was, whatever that means, he was definitely ranking, and that just struck me. So the question is,
Mm-hmm.
over policing exists, we know this
Mm-hmm.
clearly. How do you tackle the issue of over policing if that is still the attitude, where we're going to cast our nets where we can get the most fish?
So I'll say this real quick, and then I'll let Keith answer it. So here is the problem. So one of the issues when Chief Monroe came in 2008, he wanted to reverse how we look at policing, and part of that was, people used to get promoted based on how many, oh, he's a good cop, he makes a bunch of arrests, he's always out making traffic stops, and so back in the day, that was what was considered a good officer. You're coming in with a bunch of arrests, you're doing a bunch of knocking ties, a bunch of voluntary contacts, you're working, okay? So when he came, he wanted to change the focus of people that were getting promoted to get to the place like you're talking about, this young gentleman, that we focus on the community side, and that we look at people that are doing good work in the community. So that caused a huge problem right there within itself. But what he was trying to change is exactly what you just spoke of, is that to be a good officer doesn't necessarily mean that you're over here casting the net, getting the most fish. And so that's that, because it's been that way for so long, he was, had a lot of resistance, and people didn't like, moving towards that community piece. And so, yes, those things do occur. I mean, it's almost like a state trooper. I mean, he sits in the honey hole and he know where you go come through doing 90 miles an hour. It's no different than that as far as the concept of it. But we rewarded it as a department. And so a lot of departments across the country, they do still reward based on those arrests and those knock and talks and how many raid and searches you're doing and all that stuff. And until you switch the mindset to say, I would rather know, what did you do in the community today? I would rather know, what was your service to the community? You're going to have that. So that's just, that's, to me, that's a huge problem in most police departments.
Keith, you want to piggyback off of that?
And yeah, I saw a lot of officers who they almost had a highway patrol mentality. We know highway patrolmen write motor vehicle laws. Yeah. And they'll walk all the way around that car to find something to write a ticket on. And it may be a dead body in that car. They don't care as long as they can write that ticket and get that motor vehicle part in. And I work with a lot of officers. They were only interested in a drug arrest or gun. Mm-hmm. That's all they were interested in, because the people who were supporting them had that mentality of, you go out here, you make some arrests, you do these things, I'll mentor you, I'll make sure you get promoted, I'll make sure you get on this special squad, even though you've been here 2 years and somebody else has been here 10 years and they're more deserving. That's just how the system is. Yeah. And it's sad because, I mean, I've worked with guys that they actually, that's all they were interested in was, I worked in Steel Creek. So Steel Creek, we went from homeless certified billionaire, the guy who owns 3M lives in Steel Creek. And they would rather go in certain neighborhoods and spend all their time in those neighborhoods than patrol the rest of their response area, because that's all they were interested in, that arrest, that ticket, that gun, that bag of weed, that crack rock. That's all they were interested in. And, for is no matter what Chief Monroe tried to do, it was still that resistance in the department. And Vicki will remember this. Let's say you went to a storage facility and 12 storage units were broken into. We would do 12 separate reports. And it was just a number game. And then he was like, well, if they're all same place, why don't we do them all on one report? Which made sense. Mm-hmm. If we had a shooting and we had 4 victims, we would put all 4 victims on a report. So why we can't put all these same break-ins? Because one could say pretty much with certainty that the same person broke them. But it was so much talk about how he was padding the numbers, how he was sweet, but that's just the way it's always been. And it's a shame that, we, no matter how hard we try, you still have those old pieces that are embedded, and they're going to always bring those old ways back up to the forefront. And that's what causes problems.
Okay, so I want to go to Rashard Brooks briefly, because I want to talk about what ideas that you guys have in terms of police reform before we wrap up. Main question that was asked early on in the show. I'm getting to it, but what is the no, actually it was on a different feed. What is excessive force really? And why don't we have a national standard for that?
You said, what is a test?
What is excessive force? Like, what is it really? And why do we not have a national standard for that?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons, because excessive force is fluid. It's very hard to explain. Like, for instance, I could, hit you with a brick, and that could, depending upon how it's done, what damage it caused, it could be considered excessive force. And so it's hard to say what excessive force is and make it a national standard. What you have to say is that excessive force, when it is not needed, like for instance, the taser is a non-deadly tool. Okay, now let me say, we did have a taser incident in Charlotte where someone did die. Okay, so but 99.9% of the time, the taser is considered to be non-deadly. So what you have to look at are the circumstances. And that's why it's very hard to just put a blanket national thing out about excessive force, because it's going to depend on what's happening at that time, because you use the level of force needed. Now, I'm not speaking of the Brooks case right now, but you use the level of force needed to get the person, under control or to comply. So you can't say, well, this much excessive force, because this person might be pushing, this person might have a brick in their hand. And so it's a totally different thing. It's so individualized. And so that's why you can't do a national standard about excessive force. However, you can put things in place that say, if somebody has something that's non-deadly, they are running away. There's so many other things that we can put in policy in place, but excessive force is fluid. It's going to depend on what's happening, what the person's doing, what their capabilities are. Have they become incapacitated? Why? So if, let's just say, for instance, he's tased and he's incapacitated at this particular time, okay, now he pulls out the gun and shoots somebody and shoots the guy. So, now is that excessive force? He was tased. So it's just fluid. And I wish there was a way to explain it better, but it's too fluid to be able to say, bam, this happens every time excessive force is used, because you got to look at the circumstances.
And why is it so difficult then in the wake of George Floyd? And I have to step back and ask this question, but yet we still are arguing over the use of chokeholds and strangleholds, and like, why are we still having this debate, and why is it so difficult to just simply ban them?
Well, I can only tell you this. That was one of the first things that I said about reform, is that neck restraints, chokeholds, some of them call them armbar holds, depending on the department. Those things can easily be banned. But again, you have to remember, each chief of police has the ability to change their own policies. So when you start talking about national, which is what I was talking about when I spoke, you have to get, it's thousands of police agencies in this country. I mean, some of them got 6-man departments and some of them 40,000. And so to get every police chief on the same page is a problem, because here's what you'll find. The big cities might be like, yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. Somebody that has 6 officers, that's like, well, we're going to do whatever we got to do. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, you have to understand, the mentality and the number of police departments and the heads of those departments. I mean, some of those people believe that there's nothing wrong with that. And so again, that's where you have the problem with getting anything done nationally. I don't know. I mean, I thought I saw today that was going to be something that was going to be signed, the whole chokehold piece. But, most officers will tell you they don't need to use the chokehold. Most officers, they don't want to get that close to you. When you get that close to someone in an encounter like that, you're going to have a problem. Most officers would prefer not to have to get in a situation where they got to use a chokehold. So again, I don't know why we're going back and forth, but my perception would be, you have to remember how many police chiefs in this country, from departments where the police chief themselves actually answer calls for service. So we're looking at a different mentality. And so you have to realize some of those smaller agencies believe that they need to do whatever. It's almost like state troopers. They may have their nearest backup might be 30 miles away. So you got these smaller agencies that might be like, well, we're going to do whatever we got to do. And so because they have the power in their own hands to change or not change the policy, those are the problems that you run into. And that's why it's hard to make it national.
And so, Keith, I'm going to ask you this next question, because I want to pivot back to the Rashard Brooks case. Now, the officers today, the officer who was the shooter, charged with felony murder, aggravated assault, multiple counts of aggravated assault as it relates to the people who were in the actual parking lot, and then a host of other issues in terms of dealing with individual individual directives within the department itself. And then, of course, the other officer, the non-shooter, was also charged with aggravated assault as well. Now, interesting enough, obviously, for those of you who saw the press conference, it was an unusual press conference from the standpoint of the people who spoke and some of that. And it's an election year for the DA. It is what it is. But when you see that, and I even said this before I had even seen the body cam, the thing that I found disturbing, even from the basic narrative, was that there was a call to service. They have this long encounter, and he fails one field sobriety test. So that immediately set up my antenna, because I'm like, wait, what do you mean one field sobriety test? Please tell me they didn't just do the breathalyzer, because that's not going anywhere in any court. It's certainly in North Carolina, because you got to do 2 breath tests, first of all, 5 minutes apart. And if you think you're going to get past probable cause, let's at least try a field sobriety test, unless it's unsafe or not possible based on the circumstances. Clearly, if you see the body cam, he's talking. There's nothing that in the parking lot that would have prevented them from doing a walk and turn, a one-leg stand, horizontal gaze nystagmus, some sort of investigation. But yet they were in contact with him for like 43 minutes. Okay, that being said, that's just from the legal perspective. The thing that, at least initially, was he's running, he turns, he fires, as far as we can tell. As he's still running, continues to run, obviously gets the shots to the back. The big debate initially, of course, for folks who've been justifying these shootings for forever, is been, well, he was resisting arrest, or well, he fired the taser, or well, there's always some type of justification. Keith, in your experience in terms of investigating and what you've seen as far as that's concerned, obviously he's been charged with what he's been charged. In your opinion, excessive force or no, and why?
For me, it was excessive force, because they could have easily had him to park the car, gave him a ride, called someone to come and get him. That would have been the easiest de-escalation of it all. If I'm not mistaken, the traffic had went around him, so the traffic flowing, they woke him up, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't they have him to move the car into a space? It looked like they had him to move it over to a space. So for me, I felt like on the front end, they were looking to make that arrest. Regardless of what was going to happen, it was going to be an arrest. I did find some problems with the field sobriety tests that were done. I did think that they pulled the trigger, and to me, I felt like, and we were always told that if you feel it's an unlawful arrest, you have the right to fight an unlawful arrest. And I can see where he could say, well, I don't feel like you need to arrest me. Was it excessive force? Yes. They knew who he was. I mean, they had all his information. I mean, if he ran, so what? Go sign a warrant. That's how we handle it in Charlotte, right, Vicki? Yeah. It's easier to sign a warrant than chase someone and break your ankle. I've seen officers chasing people for no reason, fall and break their ankle, fall and break their leg. And then we're looking at them like, you could have went and signed a warrant. So for me, I feel like it was a force because none of it was necessary. Could have been avoided. Park the car, leave it in the parking lot, call a cab, call Uber. He said he just left his wife, let his wife come and get him. They could have shut that down. And by where they took it, I just feel like that's what's going to have them convicted, because anything else comes out, that's what's going to do them in.
And so,
and I can tell you now, if I'd have did that in Charlotte, I would have been. I think they probably would have charged me that night. And that's the God honest truth.
Mm-hmm. And so, but part of the problem is, even in North Carolina, and I don't know if it's true in Georgia, the thing that I found absolutely stunning was how quickly they released the body cam footage. Like, I just found that to be incredibly stunning. Because in North Carolina, obviously the rules were changed, or the law was changed that prevented that release. It's certainly not in a day of less than 48 hours. And so that actually has the case evaluated by the media in a way that was different from George Floyd, even though it was obviously there for everyone to see. The frustration I think people had with the police and the DA's office and everybody involved is like, you see it, why are we taking so long to get something done? And, I think part of the reason is that people thought, well, once these officers get charged, these protests are going to stop. We're going to be able to do something with police reform quietly and it'll go away, not realizing that the movement was already long underway. No. That arresting Derek Chauvin and the other officers wasn't going to stop anything. So as we wrap up, talk to me and talk to the audience about what it is that you see that is important that needs to happen in terms of police reform. Now, Vicki, I know you did a live when you were talking about banning chokeholds, strangleholds, things of that nature, and how we need to do things. There's a lot of issues, but let's deal with this issue first. I'm kind of paraphrasing what you said, but did I miss anything as far as that's concerned?
No, basically what you said. And, I said we need to focus on one thing at a time, because I think it's, again, like the question was asked about citizen groups. And like to Keith's point, we have to narrow things down to some key things that make sense and that are relevant to what's going on today. And so my purpose was for us to stick to, first of all, what's relevant. Because there's a lot of things that need to be changed in our organization, and I'm sure in many others. But stick to what we need to talk about, which right then was specifically what he did to George Floyd. So I was talking specifically about that action. So, we want to get that done and get that handled. Then my second thing was, let's look at what do we do with officers that have multiple complaints. And, I understand some of them are not substantiated. People across the country don't understand when they see, well, he had 19 complaints. Well, why isn't he gone? And so that's the next step, is really evaluating. I mean, most agencies have an early warning system, where after so many things happen with an officer, then it kind of gives them an alert that something is going on with this officer. However, the difference is, how does everybody use that information? And so a lot of people, they just look at him like, oh, okay, well, he had 3 complaints, and they put it in his performance appraisal, and that's it. And so the problem is, if you don't have an early warning system, that's for the larger agencies that have the system and have the money. Most agencies probably don't even have an early warning system. So your warning is either when something crazy happens or somebody brings it to your attention. So there's so many things that need to be put in place because, they were talking about giving more money to police. Well, let's talk about, early warning system. Let's try to make sure that every department has that. But better than that, let's talk about how do they use the information. It doesn't matter if you get the notifications that something is going on with someone if you don't do anything about it. We all know that once you start getting a bunch of courtesy complaints, that something is building. So once you start getting a bunch of complaints where the person's talking rude to somebody or they're cursing somebody or they let something slip out their mouth that they shouldn't, something is going on and it's going to escalate. And so that's kind of like, to me, the second thing. I mean, we got so many things, but we have to keep it relevant. So what happens is we go off the grid. And I'll just give you an example, the whole tear gas thing. Listen, I don't know what happened. And do I agree with people being tear gassed and not being able to get out? Absolutely not. But the reality of it is this. So when you want to change the funding, that's great. If the funding goes to the community, I don't care. But what people have to understand is at the end of the day, and I cannot speak for CMPD anymore, but what I will tell you is I am certain that we have enough tear gas left to last for years. I am also certain that we have a police foundation that has millions of dollars, that if we needed the money, we would have the money. And so I tell people, let's focus on what really makes sense. What makes sense is finding out why it happened. Who did it? Did it violate policy? If it didn't violate policy, we need to change the damn policy. So people are getting so caught up in the money aspect. And listen, I'm not saying that money shouldn't be redirected to the community. I don't really care about that. What I care about is, are we looking at the right things? And the thing is, it doesn't matter. We still have it. And so that's not going to change. What needs to change is policy and hold the person accountable. Talk about why it happened. I don't know why it happened, but let's all come together, talk about why it happened. And the people that were there that experienced it, I know I've heard it all on social media, but we're not going to get anything done by yelling about the police did this, and the police are not going to get anything done by saying, well, hey, we still got a stockpile. You know what I'm saying? We got to come together, and that's where we stop. This side says this side says this, and nothing gets resolved other than for council people and for political people to be able to take a stance that's probably best for their career. I personally don't care about that stuff. I care about let's make it right.
Okay. So a quick opinion, civil service board, too much power to
Now,
basically allow an officer to be disciplined in a way that they can actually be terminated. Because you mentioned, and this has happened, and I've represented an officer where it was the opposite, where it wasn't even things that had done within the course of his duty.
right.
Black officer recommended termination and was terminated.
Yeah.
Versus officers that may be recommended to the board, and the board sends them back. Now you stuck like Chuck with this person with no recourse. Is
Right.
that the problem there that the city council can address, or is it something else within the hierarchy that has to be addressed?
Well, city council can address some of it from a couple of perspectives because they are appointed by by city council people. And so let me just say this, and again, yeah, city council people, they're appointed by them. So here's the reality of it. Again, as I told you on the board, you'll have people that love cops, you'll have people that hate cops. The motivation for people getting on the boards has to be looked at. They now have to go to the Citizens Academy for an abbreviated version, not the whole 6 weeks or whatever it is. Now it's like a 2-week version because they need to know the impact of what their decisions make on us. The other thing is a lot of them don't like to post their decisions. They don't want their decisions to be public. If you say this officer that we say should be terminated goes back out on the street, well, Miss So-and-so, everybody should know that that's how you feel. But so they've always kept those internal. The other piece is, to be honest with you, and this is not against council, but they don't ask why you want to be. They just either grab someone or someone comes to them and says, I want to be on the board. They don't know why. They don't know their motive. Like, it is just too easy to get on there. Number one, you just got to know somebody. There's not a bunch of and we have people that they would come to us and say, hey, we need a quick civil service board quick class on Citizens Academy because this person needs to get on civil service. You have people that are leaving and they leave and who's going to fill their position? It's not paid. So again, you have to remember, sometimes these boards last for 3 days, 8 hours a day. So you're not getting paid. Are you going to take vacation from work to go sit 3 days to do that? We need to incentivize it. Number one, I don't care if it ain't but jury duty pay, but we need to incentivize it so we can start to look at the right people getting on these boards and why people, you used to have police on the board. I'll be very, very transparent. There were police on the board and they loved us, right? Now, if the chief came in and they didn't like that particular chief, then they didn't like that chief and they might well go against them. It's too much stuff within that should not be in there, because we're talking about people's careers and we're talking about other people that need that person gone because of what they've done. And so until we, and a lot of it's legislative, but until we as a city recognize that this is an important board and we should treat it as an important board, then you're going to constantly, and nothing against the people that are on there. And I'm not saying that everybody on there, I had a good friend on there, Lisa was on there, Lisa Cropper. But here's the thing, you got to get people that can look at both sides of the issue, and they can't be a lover of police or a hater of police. And that's hard to find. But if we care, then we need to look at how we do this whole civil service thing all over again.
Okay. Keith, three things that you
totally
mentioned.
agree.
Right. So, Keith, three things that you think that are particularly important now that we need to be looking at in terms of police reform. Top three.
Number one, courtesy. That's the number one issue. That's the number one complaint is courtesy. If I could ask you for your driver's license, registration, and insurance, you shouldn't have to ask me 15 times what you stopped me for. Point blank. I think the second one is that I'm hearing a lot on is recruiting. I noticed that I went and spoke to a class at C. Smith, and I was just talking to them like they knew what was going on. This is a graduating class. They graduated in May. And I was surprised that no one from CMPD had ever told them about the police cadet program, where they could be hired while they're at Johnson C. Smith, making what, $9, $10 an hour, 20 hours a week, and have their tuition and books paid for. None of them had ever heard about that. But I could guarantee you at at UNCC and Central Piedmont, those kids about it, because that's the type of relationships we have. And I think how we treat historic places where we could get African American, I think there's a different type of movement there. If they can drive around the country to recruit at Army bases, they could drive to historic Black colleges and recruit as well, instead of going to career day and showing up on career day. And then the last one I think that's really important is that we have to me, it begins and ends with the type of people that we put in that uniform. I don't know how many times I've dealt with guys where we had confrontations in the locker room. One of the last confrontations 2 weeks before I retired, and the guy said, "Let's get out there and get those MFs." And I'm like, "Who is those MFs?" And he's like, "You know." And I'm like, "No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you." And I'm like, "So tell me, who's an MF? Who's an MF in your eyes? Is it males? Is it females? Is it Blacks? Is it whites? Is it rich? Is it poor?" And that caused a lot of friction. So a part of that comes to the fact that, it's a lot of guys I work with, the first fight they ever had was in Red Man. And you probably don't know what Red Man is, but it's a controlled fight in Academy. That's the first fight they ever been in. They've ever gotten hit. And then when you get them on the street and somebody from, as we said earlier, Beatties Ford calls them an MF or talk about their mother, first thing they do is put their hand on their gun. And those are issues that, can we do that with training? The one thing I can CMPD trained to death. Is that not right, Vicki? I don't even think we could do. It's constant training all year long. If you're not in a class, you're doing something online, you have to read this and you have to sign off on it online to ensure that you understood it. So I don't think we can I think it's the type of people that we're choosing. And we have to look at where we're getting them from, because Charlotte is an inclusive city, or we like to think we're an inclusive city, but we're still getting people from very restricted areas. And then we're putting them in our neighborhoods, and it's becoming a problem. But my biggest thing right now is courtesy. I just think a lot of officers, and I've had my run-ins with officers since I've retired, and they're not current. And I've had to make a couple phone calls. I had to send recently. I had to send a deputy chief a picture of an officer sticking his middle finger up at some people. They
What?
took a picture of it. Now is that? Oh yes.
Wow.
But this is what the public's dealing with. And I don't know. For me, when we went to 13 divisions, we went to 13 departments. What may happen in my district that I may get written up and days off may not necessarily, a person in another district doing the same thing, nothing may happen to them. So, those are my issues. But law, it's never going to be right on the police side. Nothing that's ever done by the police is ever going to please the public. It's just not going to happen. But we can do some things to where we can meet on a common ground. And I mean, right now, I have a lot of the stakeholders at the table who are willing to come to that table and talk. I just can't get CMPD to come to the table. So that's another issue. Everybody's digging their heels in, and everybody's standing their ground.
Wow. That's profound. Now let me ask you this,
Oh
both of
yeah.
you.
Oh
Let me
yeah.
ask this of both of you. Is community policing dead? I mean, is it possible, because you kept saying it's a philosophy, but is there any way that that's even a possibility in this climate, to try to rebuild trust between the police and the community, or is that a unicorn pipe dream?
Well, honestly, I mean, I don't think we have a
I
choice.
can tell you from my
Go ahead,
okay.
Keith.
Okay, I can tell you, and I've reached out to the coordinators, the lieutenant, and only the captain responded to me once I reached out to him. So if they won't reach out to me and respond back to me as a town leader, I can only imagine how the citizens feel. And we had some legitimate issues that once the captain got on it, we had them fixed. But so if it's a problem for me, and we were always told that never underestimate a problem from a community member. What may be minor to us may be major to them. And I couldn't even get a phone call. So I could only imagine. And I still haven't seen the coordinators, and I've asked them to call me or come and visit me. And to this day, I've still not had a response. So is it dead? I think it's on life support. Can it be revived? Yes.
What's it going to take?
That's it.
Are you
From me?
keep the
Yeah.
thing?
Um, for me, it's going to take, I think a lot of officers are getting into community policing for the wrong reasons. They're getting into it for the hours. Coordinators don't necessarily have to answer calls. But when I was a coordinator in 3 different districts, I always led the district. I was number 1 or number 2 and was written, and I always wrote just as many tickets as the officers who wrote tickets. Because as a coordinator, doesn't stop you from being a police officer, but a lot of the police officer anymore. They're special. And we have to go from that mentality, and they have to realize that if there's a call and you roll up on the call, you shouldn't have to call another unit to answer that call. You're there, handle it. And that's a lot of what's going on now. How do you fix that? That's a in-house. Sergeants and lieutenants and captains need to be more mindful of the Indians out on the reservation.
Okay, so I'm gonna say Bruce's question for
Vicki?
last before we wrap up, because actually, Vicki, I want to ask you this question from Jessica, and I think it's a really good question. I'm gonna pose it to you because I'm covering your face. Wait a minute, let me try.
It's okay.
Because your major was psychology, and I think this is a question that I think is perfect for you. Do you think there's adequate psychological testing done upon hiring officers and what other things should be included, and is there any ongoing mental health assessments done, particularly to keep a pulse on where a law enforcement officer's mindset is?
So very, very good question. So first of all, yes, we do psychological testing at the beginning before they go into the academy. It's part of their background. It's part of the whole process. Now, is that psychological test the best test? I can't tell you that. Is it probably time to maybe look at it and see, what exactly all, it does? Because you remember, most of these things are not changed year to year. We're like just like any other organization. You get your application done, you have your psychological testing by typically the same people. You may look at it every couple of years. Is it probably time to look at that again? I would say so. But our tests focus a lot on trying to figure out if people are word phrases, and if they are a child molester, they're relating certain things that should not be connected. It focuses a lot on that. And so, is there something else out there? It possibly could be. I think, like most agencies, there's certain things that we don't review regularly. And I would think psychological testing, I was over the academy for many years, and I know that we didn't necessarily look at it, look at changing it while I was there. But it's a good point. It is time to probably take a look at that. The mental health side of it, I would tell you, I think people forget that, we are humans. And I will tell you that you have to remember when people are working in same areas over and over. So let's just say I'm working in, say, an African American community for years after years. What happens to people? They become very desensitized. It's no different than when you're in homicide and you see a dead body every other day. You actually become desensitized. And we have people that we have to remember that the family is standing there because we might be standing over here talking about lunch, and the body is right here, and that has happened before, and they could not believe it. And so people become desensitized, and they do the same thing when they work a community where either they have not, as Keith said, they have not ingrained themselves either into the community and getting to know people. And it's just these people. And, I come here and, it's kind of like the coyote, and, it's just I come in every day and do this and go home. And now that's obviously not all officers. Many of them, work in the communities that they love. The people know them, and they know people in the community. But people get desensitized, and so yes, I think that we should do more mental health testing. Do we do that? No, and there's a variety of reasons. As far as the testing, it's a variety of reasons because a lot of that stuff is HIPAA, and so if someone is having some type of mental issue like that, we're not going to know unless it reaches a level to where it is now impacting their job, and we have to become involved. So you also have to remember these officers got, like everybody else, they got kids with cancer, they got, health issues, they got all types of stuff. And do we do the best job at probably evaluating, what's going on with people? Probably not. And that's something I think that no agency does a good job at. But I will say, I was a part of a group to help bring the first full-time psychologist to the police department. So we are one of the few agencies that have a full-time psychologist. Now, he's only been there for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years. And it takes a while to get people to trust that they will come in there and they can tell them that they're having an issue and that he's not going to go tell someone. Because you have to understand, this is a big, I am man. And so they don't want people to know these issues. And so, yes, mental health has become a problem within our organization. I can tell you, I sent out an email before I left, telling someone about a women in leadership class that was asked to be forwarded, and I forwarded. I get an email back that says, "Well, what about me? This is about women. What about me?" And I'm like, "Is this officer okay?" I mean, so it's all types of little stuff like that. It's stuff like that that happens every day. And so mental health definitely needs to be something that needs to be looked at more seriously. Now, can I say that's the reason why some of these things out here are happening? I'm not going to say that, but I will say there are probably some things that have happened that had we looked at the person and been able to see what's going on with them, we might have could predicted that this is not someone that needs to be on the street. And it is hard to remove someone from the street, just like it is hard to get them fired.
Okay, so I have to ask this
Yes.
question,
Yes.
and I'm gonna finish with Bruce's because I didn't see it in the comments, but I saw it on the watch party. Charles asked, okay, so here's where and I'm gonna paraphrase. So we have it. Obviously, there's a disconnect in many ways between the police and the community that's just been kind of highlighted over what's been happening over the last many years, not just with these last two incidences. How can police officers expect the community to report things that are going on in their own neighborhoods if this thin blue line is having officers not even reporting what's going on within their own amongst their own colleagues and the things that they're seeing their own colleagues do? Because Vicki, you mentioned earlier in the show that you had an incident with someone and you were the one that was taken away in the police car, for those of you just tuning in. So I mean, if this thin blue line exists, how does the police expect the community to provide information about things that are going on in their community when this blue line exists and police officers don't even police themselves and they're protecting themselves, not the family that you spoke of, but protecting themselves in such a way that's detrimental to the community? So how do we balance those two things?
So I'll just say this real quick, and Keith may have a better response to this. You know, the reality of it is they have to be able to be ensured that the information that they give does not get back out. And so I will tell you that have we done a good job at that? Sometimes. And sometimes not. And you know, sometimes it's not the officer's fault. Sometimes it's the dispatcher's fault. You know, sometimes they tell information they're not supposed to tell. And I do think that that's something that we all could look at better to see, how do we do that? Most people want to give their stuff anonymously. However, they do have to remember too, sometimes they give stuff anonymously and it's almost impossible to do anything about it because the person will know who gave it. You know what I'm saying? And so it's two things. It's, we got to trust each other. We have to do a better job of ensuring that the information does not get out. Number one. Number two, you know, we've created, you know, Crime Stoppers. We've created ways for people to give information without actually telling who they are. But then oftentimes they don't give enough detailed information and we need to talk to them. You know, they just want to call and leave the information. So I do get it. You know, I'm real big. I spoke on this a while back about the whole snitching thing. You know, I feel like the reality of it is it's our communities. And just like they want us to take a chance and tell on an officer, and then this officer has to worry about if his backup is coming, you have to make the decision if you tell that if that's going to be safe for you. For me, it's different if your safety is in jeopardy. When I'm talking about stitches, when 30 people know who did it and nobody will come up, it's a little different if it's just you, because then they can figure out who did it. So I'm saying that any information that you get, and I got people that know, people would never believe, that will call me and tell me anything that's going on in the community because of the relationship that we have. And they know that I'm going to make sure that it gets to a person that can do something about it, and they're not going to know. So some of that, the onus is on us.
Okay. Keith?
Yeah. For me, it was always, I would always tell people, like I said before, it's not about you connecting with the whole department. It was about you having that relationship with that one officer and letting that up to decide what's the best way to proceed. There were times I was given information and I was like, man, I can't do anything with that because they're going to know it's you.
Right.
But then I remember a very high profile case we had where the person came to me and wanted to tell me some info. And I'm like, don't tell me anything. Call crime, put the info first. And I said, but just remember, no detail, leave no detail out, you know. But it just boils down to, can we fix that as a whole? Probably won't happen in our lifetime, but we can. I think once we start that relationship building part and officers start getting out and building those relationships and that trust factor starts to come in, I think we can start to see some issues start to slowly go away. On,
Right.
you know, on that level.
So Bruce, y'all know Bruce. Hey
Okay.
Bruce. Bruce
Oh
wants
my
to
God.
know.
He's my classmate. He was my
Per-
classmate.
Perfect
Big
last
head.
question. Perfect last question. If you had to do it all over again, would you still go into law enforcement? Why or why not? Why are you leaving, Vicki? Go ahead, Keith.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
I'll have you go last,
Okay.
Vicki. Keith, what would you say?
All right. For me, coming from the entertainment world and knowing what I went through, I probably would not have done law enforcement if I knew I would go through that. The one thing I can say is what I went through made me a stronger man, and I can't discard that in my life. Would I go through it again? Yes. I would just like to go through it and not go through all the stuff I went through.
Gotcha.
but I would definitely do law enforcement again. It's given me the ability to touch so many people's lives.
What say you, Vicki?
Tell your classmate, hey.
Only he would ask that because because he was my classmate. So mine is similar to Keith. You know, would I would I go through what I went through again? No. My first 20 18, 19 years were okay. Even though I had bumps in the road and those things that I dealt with, it was okay. It took it to an all-time high, between the first African American chief and then me making assistant chief. And would I go through that again? No. Now, what I will say is I enjoyed my career. I'm appreciative of the fact that I was there and I know the things that I've done, the people I've helped. I know that there are certain things that would have happened had I not been there. And I sometimes get a little frustrated when people, forget about you've had two African American chiefs, African American, and we fight. And we fight for everybody, but we in particularly try to make sure that our Black and brown community are treated fairly. Now, whether we can make that happen every day, all day, we're not perfect, but we did our best. And so, would I do it again? Certain parts, yes, because I enjoyed impacting people's lives. I felt like I was that person that everybody could call and they felt they could call me. They knew if they called me, I was going to do something about it if they were in the right. They also knew me well enough to know that I don't play the, okay, I'm Black and something happened to me. And I have to make sure that everything is right. I don't just go off of race. And so I feel like I brought a lot to the table. So I would do it from that angle because I felt like I gave a lot to the community. But as far as what I went through and what it did to my health and, the years that you deal with the things that I've dealt with, which has been at a different level than most people, I would not do that again. No.
Okay. And so, as we wrap up, we're not. What I'm gonna do is have you, because we're gonna find a date. I want to come back and circle back on the defund issue because we just we this has been so incredible as far as information. We just don't have time to get to that tonight. But I do want to thank both of you so much for all of the information that you shared. Just a few takeaways for those of you who tuned in later after the broadcast started. First, you can catch the replay on YouTube or on the Facebook channel at The Conversation with Yolanda Trotman. A few things that Keith mentioned specifically was getting involved in the Citizens Academy. I'm not sure when the next one is, but it happens at least a couple of times a year so that you can get a behind the scenes look. The other thing is that at least locally, in terms of what we can do, is that we as citizens, it's probably time to start asking questions about the Civil Service Board, how people can get involved. Not that we're just putting people in, that we're demanding that City Council take a closer look at it, take a closer look at how it's
Yes.
not only how it's structured, but how people are chosen.
Yes.
And that there's transparency and this could be done by simple ordinance. Just simply change the ordinance that makes their decisions public. It shouldn't be a discretionary factor of deciding whether or not their decisions are public or not. It should absolutely be made public. Just like whoever's on the board is public, their decisions should be made public because not only does it affect the life and the livelihood of that individual officer, it also affects the community depending on what that decision is. And possibly looking at ways to untie the hands of the chief in terms of actually making disciplinary decisions that stick, that matter. A lot of Keith's takeaways as far as what he talked about, also as far as reform, is dealing with courtesy specifically. Um, some of that is learned behavior, some of that perhaps by training, recruitment, making sure people know where and how they can be recruited, the information that's important. His email is Keith Way, Keith Way at hotmail.com. Yes, he still has Hotmail. We're not judging him. He still has Hotmail. But also, it's also important
I
that
have
people.
Gmail too.
Yeah, you didn't give me your
I got
Gmail. You gave
AOL.
me. You better not still have it. It's like having like Earthlink. But
Hmm.
anyway, I digress. I digress. But courtesy, recruitment, and of course the attitude as well. Now, the as far as what Vicki talked about now, and I believe this may still be. Is this still accessible through your Facebook page as far as the email that people could send to deal with the issue of putting information out there to local sheriffs about about chokeholds and restraints. Is that still available?
So I put the information, I didn't post the letter. I posted the letter I wrote to them. And in my follow up, I told everyone that we needed to hold off on the letter. We need to give them an opportunity because they acknowledged my letter. They acknowledged that they were going to be meeting and discussing those very same things. And I said, in case we didn't know, a lot of the police chiefs are pretty busy right now. But I said we need to give them an opportunity because, as you can see, one of the things was the chokeholds. And so they are working on that. And the neck restraints. And so before we start sending letters that might just go into a pipeline, everybody needs to watch what's happening. And then if what we discussed and what we want doesn't happen, then we do that. And so I told everybody, let's just wait. Now everybody's, on the legislative slide and they're working on it. So yes, they will be able to get it if needed. Yes.
Okay.
And I have sent some to some individual people that asked me to send it individually, but yes.
And I do want to clarify because I see where Lisa made a comment that the civil service board decisions are not a secret. There's a difference, though, between the secrecy and the public availability of the
Mhm.
decisions because of the personnel issues. Am I
Right.
misstating that? I want to make sure that I'm correct in my assumption.
Lisa may have to tell you that, but what I do know is that there was a time that we didn't know who decided what, like who voted which way, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how the public gets that information. And
Okay.
so that's a piece that I'm talking about. And so it may not be that it's not published, it's not, but you would have to go look for it. And we shouldn't have to go look for it because when we're determining whether officers should be fired, then people have a right to know, what people voted and how they voted. And so
Okay.
that's just my opinion.
Okay. And so, so those are some of the takeaways that, as far as those of you who are watching, or if you're catching the replay, as far as that's concerned, what I challenge you, if you're not local to Charlotte, this is where it becomes important that you put your local officials, whoever's in charge of your policing decisions and your directives or whatever the case may be, that some of these issues are issues that can be dealt with internally very easily. In Charlotte, most certainly, some of these can be done by local ordinance to deal with some of these issues because we have to, as some people said, it's so important that there are issues that are decided that are beneficial to the community, whether it's a hiring and firing decision or whether or not there's true community policing and things of that nature. So I appreciate both of you immensely for giving us your perspectives, both from both sides, and obviously talking about your story in a very substantive way. So if you have questions for them, they're both available on social media. Both are very responsive if you have questions. They're not bound by, they can't say certain things because they're both retired. And what I love about both of them is that they have both been very vocal in terms of police reform in ways that actually make sense. So this isn't the end of our conversation for sure. When we come back and do our wrap up, we'll have some discussions there. But this is not the time for any of us to be passive when we're dealing with the issue of police reform because our voices do matter. Our voices absolutely have power, and we have to
Yes.
make sure that we use them in a way that matters. So again, thank you all for tuning in. For those of you who have not done so already, make sure that you like and you follow and subscribe at all things at the Convo Pod Show. Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you so much, Keith, for all of your insight. Love you to life. Thank you for
Love you
everything
too.
that you've done. And I think the biggest thing that's important for anyone watching is that,
Oh, you're back.
listen, we are dealing with a lot of issues. There's so many amazing officers out there that really, truly protect and serve every single day. And we can't get lost in the narrative that all police are a certain kind of way because that's just not true. But we have to support those officers that are out here doing good things, but we also have to be willing to root out those who are not, and not hog tie folks who are trying to get those officers out so that they cannot get them out because of whatever ordinances or laws that prevent them from doing so. So shout out to all of those officers, male, female, black, white, or whomever, that really are doing their job at a high level, who really truly do believe in the community and give back to in the community in a way that means something. We see you. So we will see you all next week on The Conversation. Next week is one-on-one with our Sheriff, Gary McFadden. If you know anything about Sheriff McFadden, he's going to keep it real. We're going to talk about what's going on in our detention centers, what's going on in terms of reforms as far as mass incarceration, what that means for Charlotte, what that means on a national level. It's going to be a real hoot if you know anything about him. So we will see you next Wednesday, 8 p.m. sharp here on The Conversation Live. Thank you guys for tuning in. Have a wonderful week, wonderful evening. And as always, stay safe. Thank you guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Yolanda.
Love you much.